The storm that claims the merchant vessel. Cormorant's pride operates with violence that transforms familiar ocean into chaos, where natural laws bend beneath fury, that recognizes no human authority, no careful navigation, no desperate prayers offered by sailors who discover that experience provides inadequate preparation for tempests that reach beyond normal meteorological patterns into territory. Here, survival depends on chance rather than skill or preparation that countless voyages have developed through accumulated wisdom. Callum Reid watches 30 years of maritime knowledge become useless as waves tower above mainmast height, while wind velocity strips rigging like paper, understanding through growing terror that this storm encompasses forces beyond natural weather patterns to include oceanic violence that operates according to principles his experience cannot predict or navigate through conventional seamanship. At normal Atlantic crossings have refined into reliable routine. The ship that has carried him through profitable cargo runs across familiar trade routes, breaks apart with violence that speaks of wood and metal, meeting forces beyond structural capacity to resist, creating recognition that vessel which seemed permanent part of his identity. Captain's quarters where planning occurred, deck where authority operated, cargo holds where prosperity accumulated. Dissolve into scattered debris that current claims with indifference that encompasses both material loss and approaching mortality. When final plunge begins, as hull integrity fails beneath pressure that engineering cannot withstand, Callum understands with crystalline clarity that ocean claims everything: reputation earned through successful voyages, wealth accumulated through careful trading, future plans whose achievement required survival that circumstances no longer permit through individual effort, whose limitations become absolute when nature demonstrates power that human capability cannot resist through any preparation or skill. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The water that claims him encompasses cold beyond normal oceanic temperature, to include depth that pressure creates through descent, whose momentum carries consciousness into darkness, where human sensory apparatus fails to provide information necessary for orientation, creating disorientation that encompasses both physical location and temporal awareness, as drowning process begins through involuntary reflexes whose operation determines whether death arrives through suffocation or pressure that increasing depth imposes. The struggle that follows encompasses both instinctive survival response and growing recognition that individual effort provides insufficient resource for escape from circumstances whose scope extends beyond personal capability to effect through swimming technique or breath control, that surface survival relies upon when distance to air becomes achievable through physical exertion rather than impossible through depths that eliminate hope. But it is intervention rather than individual capability that transforms inevitable death into unexpected survival through assistance, whose source remains unclear during unconsciousness, that rescue requires when body systems shut down to preserve essential function through biological emergency response that operates beyond conscious control to maintain life during circumstances that normal awareness cannot endure. The sensation that accompanies rescue encompasses movement through water, whose characteristics suggest guidance rather than natural current, creating awareness that survival depends on external assistance, whose nature remains unknown, while consciousness fluctuates between awareness and oblivion, that near-death experience creates through biological systems, whose recovery requires sustained support, rather than momentary intervention. Live, commands voice that carries harmonics, suggesting non-human origin, while meaning transcends language barriers through universal recognition of intention that encompasses both authority and care, creating understanding that survival depends on acceptance of assistance, whose conditions remain unknown during emergency circumstances, that eliminate negotiation about terms requiring later consideration. The environment that consciousness gradually recognizes encompasses neither surface ocean nor familiar terrestrial location, but underwater cavern, whose atmospheric composition permits breathing through magical rather than natural means, creating recognition that rescue has transported him into territory where normal physical laws operate differently, according to principles his experience cannot predict or understand. Awake, observe same voice with satisfaction that encompasses both clinical assessment and personal investment in outcome, whose achievement provides foundation for relationship, whose nature remains undefined during initial recovery, that encompasses both physical healing and environmental adaptation to circumstances requiring adjustment beyond normal human experience. The figure that visual focus gradually resolves encompasses beauty that operates beyond human aesthetic standards to include otherworldly quality that speaks of different evolutionary development, creating immediate recognition that rescue originates from oceanic species whose intervention violates natural boundaries between terrestrial and marine existence, according to separation that both populations typically maintain through mutual avoidance. Mermaid, Callum whispers with recognition that encompasses both wonder at mythological creatures' reality and growing understanding that survival depends on being whose existence literature describes, but practical experience has never encompassed through encounters that normal maritime career provides, despite decades spent navigating waters where folklore claims such beings reside. Noreen, she corrects, with voice that carries authority beneath courtesy, while expression reveals assessment that encompasses both clinical evaluation of recovery progress and personal judgment about character, whose qualities determine whether rescue recipient deserves assistance, whose provision violated ancient restrictions about interspecies contact. You saved me, he states with recognition that encompasses both gratitude for life preservation and growing awareness that assistance creates obligations whose scope extends beyond simple appreciation to include responsibility that rescue establishes according to principles operating beyond human understanding of proper relationship between assistance provider and recipient. I claimed you, she responds with correction that encompasses both cultural context and personal decision, whose implications extend beyond humanitarian assistance to include relationship establishment, according to oceanic law that rescue creates when circumstances demonstrate necessity for intervention, that violates normal boundaries between species whose separation serves mutual protection through avoiding complications. The clarification that transforms gratitude into recognition of change status creates understanding that survival encompasses more than simple life preservation to include fundamental alteration in existence, whose scope encompasses both environmental relocation and social obligation, that rescue establishes according to oceanic custom, whose operation differs significantly from human expectations. About proper relationship dynamics. Claimed meaning? Saved life creates bond that oceanic law recognizes as permanent connection between rescuer and rescued. Noreen explains with cultural context that encompasses both legal framework and personal choice, whose exercise establishes relationship, whose nature operates beyond simple assistance to include ongoing responsibility that encompasses both protection and companionship. Bond meaning? Meaning you belong to me through rescue that created obligation transcending simple gratitude to encompass permanent association. She clarifies with directness that encompasses both cultural honesty and personal decision, whose acceptance determines whether relationship develops according to mutual cooperation or resistance that could complicate circumstances requiring adaptation to environment. All conditions beyond normal human survival capability. Belong as in ownership? Belong as in partnership that honors rescue bond while acknowledging individual worth, that relationship preserves rather than eliminates through association. Noreen corrects with emphasis that distinguishes between property relationship and personal connection, whose development serves both individual welfare and cultural tradition, that rescue establishes according to ancient law governing species assistance. The conversation that establishes relationship parameters creates understanding that survival encompasses both life preservation and fundamental change in existence, whose scope includes environmental adaptation alongside social obligation, that rescue creates according to oceanic culture, whose principles operate differently from human expectations about autonomy following emergency assistance, whose a provision typically creates temporary rather than permanent connection. What if I refuse partnership? Refusal remains possible choice, though survival without oceanic protection becomes unlikely, given environmental circumstances that human physiology cannot manage independently. Noreen responds with honesty that encompasses both respect for individual autonomy and practical assessment of survival capability, whose limitations make independence dangerous despite theoretical right to reject assist. And environmental circumstances meaning? meaning oceanic depth where atmospheric pressure eliminates normal breathing, while magical adaptation permits survival through connection that rescue established. She explains with technical information that encompasses both immediate life support and longer-term dependency, whose scope extends beyond temporary assistance to include sustained magical intervention necessary for continued existence. So choice exists between partnership and death? Choice exists between partnership that honors rescue bond and independence that eliminates protection necessary for survival. Noreen clarifies with distinction that encompasses both practical reality and cultural framework, whose operation acknowledges individual autonomy, while recognizing environmental limitations that make certain choices inadvisable despite theoretical availability. The assessment that establishes both possibility and practical constraints creates recognition that relationship acceptance operates through informed consent rather than simple compulsion, while acknowledging that circumstances limit viable alternatives through environmental factors beyond personal control to effect through individual capability alone. I accept partnership, Callum states with decision that encompasses both practical necessity and growing recognition that rescue provider deserves consideration beyond simple survival calculation, through qualities that assistance demonstrates about character worthy of respect, despite unfamiliar cultural framework that relationship requires. Partnership accepted with understanding that adaptation requires time, while cooperation serves mutual benefit. Noreen responds with satisfaction, that encompasses both cultural validation and personal pleasure about relationship establishment, whose development will determine whether rescue achieves lasting success rather than temporary survival extension. As initial conversation establishes foundation for relationship, whose scope encompasses both survival necessity and personal connection, underwater cavern that provides refuge transforms into permanent residence requiring adaptation that extends beyond simple environmental adjustment to include cultural learning, whose achievement determines whether partnership develops into authentic relationship or remains simple survival arrangement. The beginning that emerges from shipwreck crisis encompasses both loss of previous existence and opportunity for unprecedented experience through relationship that challenges assumptions about species boundaries while creating possibilities that normal circumstances would never provide through encounter between individuals whose compatibility transcends environmental differences. The adaptation that follows partnership acceptance encompasses both physical adjustment to underwater environment and psychological accommodation to relationship dynamics, whose scope extends beyond normal human courtship patterns to include oceanic customs that operate according to different principles about personal boundaries, romantic development, and individual autonomy, whose exercise require misunderstanding cultural context that experience gradually reveals. The cavern system that serves as residence encompasses both practical functionality and aesthetic beauty, whose combination reflects Noreen's personality through living space that honors oceanic environment while providing comfort that long-term habitation requires, creating recognition that isolation has been carefully chosen rather than accidentally imposed through circumstances beyond personal control. Chambers provide different environments that adaptation requires, Noreen explains during orientation, that encompasses both practical instruction and cultural education, whose scope includes understanding about Mermaid domestic organization that differs significantly from human household management through approaches that honor oceanic ecosystem integration alongside personal preference. Sleeping alcove maintains optimal temperature through thermal vents, while water circulation provides both fresh oxygen and waste removal. She continues with technical information that encompasses both environmental engineering and magical enhancement, whose operation permits comfortable habitation despite oceanic depth that normal human physiology cannot sustain. Food preparation encompasses both gathering techniques that oceanic environment permits and dietary adaptation that human physiology requires through modification that maintains health while honoring oceanic nutritional principles. She adds with practical instruction about survival, whose achievement requires learning new approaches to basic necessities. The daily routine that develops encompasses both environmental exploration and cultural immersion, whose scope includes understanding about oceanic society through individual perspective that extended isolation has created, revealing personality that encompasses both independence and longing for companionship, whose fulfillment rescue relationship provides through circumstances that normal social interaction would never create. Gathering expeditions provide both nutritional necessity and environmental education, Noreen explains, while demonstrating foraging techniques that encompass identification of edible species, harvesting methods that maintain ecosystem balance, and preparation approaches that serve both palatability and nutritional requirements for mixed diet accommodating human physiology. Exploration permits understanding of territorial boundaries while revealing oceanic geography that navigation requires. She continues with instruction that encompasses both practical knowledge and cultural education, whose scope includes recognition of other oceanic inhabitants, whose territorial claims require respectful acknowledgement, despite individual rather than tribal relationship. Communication with oceanic entities operates through respect rather than authority. She emphasizes with cultural education that encompasses both diplomatic necessity and philosophical principle, whose application determines whether interactions serve mutual benefit rather than one-sided advantage that could create territorial conflicts. The relationship that develops through shared daily activities encompasses both practical cooperation and emotional connection, whose growth operates according to gradual revelation of personality characteristics that compatibility demonstrates despite obvious differences in background, environment, and cultural expectation about proper romantic development, whose pace varies significantly between species traditions. Your previous existence encompassed leadership responsibility through maritime authority, Noreen observes during conversation that explores background, whose understanding provides foundation for personal connection beyond simple survival arrangement through recognition of individual worth, that rescue preserved rather than simple life, whose continuation serves no particular purpose. Ship captain, whose career encompassed both commercial success and personal satisfaction through work that provided both income and identity, Callum confirms with honesty about previous existence, whose value encompassed more than simple material achievement to include personal fulfillment that professional competence created through accumulated expertise. Loss encompasses both material disruption and identity crisis, when circumstances eliminate not just possessions, but social role that define self-worth. She continues with psychological insight that encompasses both cultural understanding about human attachment patterns and personal empathy, whose development suggests emotional investment beyond simple rescue obligation. Identity reconstruction requires discovering new purposes that current circumstances permit, rather than mourning previous existence whose restoration remains impossible. She suggests with wisdom that encompasses both practical advice and personal philosophy about adaptation, whose achievement requires acceptance, rather than resistance to fundamental change. The conversation that addresses psychological adjustment reveals depth of understanding about human emotional needs, whose recognition suggests either extensive observation of human behavior or natural empathy that transcends species boundaries through universal recognition of psychological requirements that trauma creates regardless of biological differences. Your isolation was chosen rather than imposed, Callum observes with recognition that living arrangement reflects personal preference rather than social rejection, creating curiosity about circumstances that solitary existence serves, despite obvious capacity for relationship that rescue demonstrates through competent care, whose provision requires both skill and emotional investment. Oceanic society operates through collective decision-making that individual preference must accommodate, Noreen explains with cultural context that encompasses both social organization and personal philosophy, whose development led to territorial separation that preserves autonomy while maintaining cultural connection through distance rather than conflict. Disagreement about territorial expansion created political division that isolation resolves through geographic separation rather than continued argument. She continues with political background that encompasses both principled opposition and practical wisdom about conflict resolution that serves individual welfare, alongside community stability, through accommodation rather than confrontation. Philosophical differences about human contact created additional controversy that separation eliminates while maintaining personal freedom to exercise individual judgment. She adds with revelation that encompasses both cultural violation and personal choice, whose exercise through rescue demonstrates commitment to principles transcending social pressure. The revelation that rescue violated cultural restrictions creates understanding that assistance encompasses personal sacrifice alongside humanitarian obligation, making relationship significance extend beyond simple survival assistance to include demonstration of character whose worth transcends social conformity through choices that honor individual conscience over collective pressure. Social isolation accepted in exchange for moral autonomy. Social isolation that preserves individual integrity while maintaining cultural connection through distance that prevents direct conflict. Noreen clarifies with distinction that encompasses both personal sacrifice and philosophical principle, whose maintenance requires sustained commitment despite social costs that isolation imposes. Your rescue represents further cultural violation that increased isolation. Rescue represents individual choice that honors universal principles over cultural restriction. She responds with conviction that encompasses both personal philosophy and cultural criticism, whose application demonstrates character, whose strength transcends social pressure through commitment to higher principles. The discussion that reveals philosophical foundation for rescue creates deeper understanding about character, whose worth encompasses both individual virtue and cultural wisdom, that recognizes universal principles transcending tribal restrictions, when circumstances demonstrate higher moral obligation than simple rule compliance. Partnership with human represents permanent separation from oceanic society. Partnership represents choice that cultural evolution will eventually validate when wisdom transcends tradition. Noreen responds with confidence that encompasses both personal conviction and cultural prediction, whose accuracy depends on social progress that individual example might catalyze through demonstration of successful interspecies cooperation. The recognition that relationship encompasses both personal fulfillment and cultural pioneering creates understanding that partnership serves purposes larger than individual satisfaction through example that could influence broader social development toward acceptance of interspecies cooperation, whose benefits extend beyond personal relationship to encompass environmental advantage. As evening settles into rhythm that underwater environment creates through different light patterns than surface existence provides, relationship development encompasses both physical intimacy and emotional connection, whose growth serves both individual fulfillment and cultural innovation through partnership that demonstrates possibility for love, transcending species boundaries when shared values. Create foundation for authentic relationship. The bond that rescue established evolves beyond simple survival arrangement into genuine partnership, whose development honors both individual autonomy and mutual attraction through relationship, that encompasses respect for personal dignity alongside growing emotional investment that circumstances have created through extraordinary encounter between compatible individuals whose connection transcend environmental differences. The weeks that pass in underwater sanctuary encompass both deepening intimacy and growing awareness that relationship exists within larger political context, whose scope extends beyond personal choice to include cultural implications that external observation could transform into territorial crisis, requiring resolution through confrontation, whose outcome determines whether love remains private air or becomes public controversy. The signs that privacy has been compromised emerge through environmental changes that Noreen's experience recognizes as territorial surveillance, whose presence indicates official attention from oceanic authority, whose concern about cultural violation requires investigation that could result in intervention disrupting relationship, whose development serves both personal fulfillment and philosophica. Full principle about interspecies cooperation. Water currents carry scents that indicate observer presence. Noreen explains with tension that encompasses both protective instinct and cultural knowledge about official procedures, whose operation threatens relationship through enforcement of restrictions that rescue violated according to ancient law, whose modification requires collective agreement rather than individual choice. Observer presence meaning official investigation? Investigation that determines whether cultural violation merits enforcement action or exceptional circumstances justify policy reconsideration. She responds with cultural context that encompasses both legal framework and political possibility, whose realization depends on evidence that relationship serves oceanic welfare rather than simple personal preference that disregards community stability. What evidence would justify policy reconsideration? Evidence that interspecies cooperation provides benefit transcending cultural restriction through demonstration of mutual advantage that traditional separation eliminates. Noreen explains with strategic thinking that encompasses both personal preservation and cultural advancement, whose achievement requires proving relationship value extends beyond individual satisfaction. The conversation that addresses external threats creates recognition that love exists within political context, whose implications extend beyond personal choice to include cultural precedent, whose establishment through relationship success could influence broader social development toward acceptance of interspecies, cooperation that serves environmental benefit. Environmental benefit meaning oceanic ecosystem management that benefits from human maritime knowledge, while terrestrial environmental protection gains from oceanic wisdom about marine resource preservation. She clarifies, with vision that encompasses both practical cooperation and philosophical advancement toward mutual understanding, rather than territorial separation. The preparation that follows surveillance recognition encompasses both defensive planning and evidence gathering, whose scope includes documentation of relationship benefits that could support policy reconsideration. When official investigation requires justification for cultural violation, whose tolerance depends on demonstrable advantage rather than simple personal preference. Your maritime experience encompasses knowledge about ship construction, navigation techniques, and cargo preservation that oceanic transportation could benefit from. Noreen observes with assessment that encompasses both personal capability and practical application, whose demonstration could provide evidence supporting relationship justification. Oceanic knowledge about current patterns, weather prediction, and marine resource location could enhance human navigation while promoting environmental protection. She continues with reciprocal benefit identification, whose documentation serves both strategic necessity and cultural advancement toward cooperation rather than separation. The project that emerges encompasses both practical demonstration and cultural innovation, whose scope includes creating navigation charts that combine human cartographic technique with oceanic knowledge about current patterns, depth variations, and seasonal changes whose accuracy surpasses either species' individual capability through collaborative approach. The work that partnership produces encompasses both technical achievement and cultural bridge, whose existence demonstrates practical benefit from interspecies cooperation, while creating foundation for broader social acceptance of relationship that serves community welfare alongside personal fulfillment through love that transcends traditional boundaries. Charts achieve accuracy impossible through single-species knowledge. Callum observes with recognition that collaborative work produces results superior to individual capability, while creating evidence that relationship serves purposes larger than personal preference through practical benefit that both communities could gain from expanded cooperation. Navigation improvement serves both oceanic safety and environmental protection through reduced shipwrecks that contaminate marine ecosystem while improving human maritime success. Noreen adds with environmental perspective that encompasses both practical benefit and philosophical principle about mutual welfare rather than competitive advantage. The approaching presence that environmental awareness detects encompasses both individual authority and collective representation, whose arrival indicates official investigation, whose outcome determines whether relationship receives cultural acceptance or faces enforcement action that separation requires through ancient law, whose modification needs collective approval rather than individual accept. Ion. Thalassa approaches with tribunal authority. Noreen announces with recognition that encompasses both personal anxiety and cultural understanding about official procedures, whose operation determines whether love survives political scrutiny through demonstration of community benefit, rather than simple personal preference that disregards cultural stability. Tribunal authority meaning judicial power. Judicial power that evaluates cultural violations while considering exceptional circumstances that policy reconsideration might justify. She explains with legal context that encompasses both threat and opportunity, whose realization depends on evidence presentation that convinces authority about relationship value extending beyond individual satisfaction. The arrival that transforms private sanctuary into official courtroom encompasses both ceremonial dignity and practical authority, whose exercise determines whether relationship continues through cultural acceptance or ends through enforcement action that ancient law permits when circumstances demonstrate community threat rather than individual choice about personal association. Noreen of the outer depths. Thalassa announces with formal recognition that encompasses both individual identity and cultural position, whose significance indicates official standing within community, whose law's relationship has violated through rescue, that established permanent bond between species that traditional separation maintains. Honored thalassa. Noreen responds with ceremonial courtesy that encompasses both personal respect and cultural protocol, whose operation acknowledges authority while maintaining individual dignity during proceedings, whose outcome affects both personal welfare and cultural precedent about interspecies relationship acceptance. Cultural violation has been observed through rescue that established permanent bond with surface dweller. Thalassa states with official charge that encompasses both factual accuracy and legal framework whose application threatens relationship through enforcement action, unless exceptional circumstances justify policy reconsideration. Rescue honored universal principle that life preservation transcends cultural restriction when circumstances demonstrate moral obligation. Noreen responds with defense that encompasses both personal philosophy and cultural criticism, whose validity depends on community acceptance of universal principles over tribal limitation. Defense noted, though, precedent requires consideration of community welfare alongside individual choice. Thalassa acknowledges with judicial balance that encompasses both legal framework and practical wisdom about social stability, whose preservation requires careful evaluation of innovation, whose acceptance could establish precedent affecting future relationships. The examination that follows encompasses both evidence presentation and philosophical argument, whose scope includes demonstration of practical benefit that relationship produces, alongside moral justification for cultural violation that rescue represented through circumstances requiring immediate action rather than committee deliberation about proper procedure. Navigation charts demonstrate practical benefit from knowledge combination that neither species achieves independently. Callum presents with evidence that encompasses both technical achievement and cultural innovation, whose value extends beyond personal relationship to include community advantage that expanded cooperation could provide. Environmental protection improves through coordination that reduces maritime accidents while preserving oceanic ecosystem integrity. Noreen adds with environmental argument that encompasses both practical benefit and philosophical principle about mutual welfare rather than competitive advantage that traditional separation maintains. Chart accuracy surpasses conventional human cartography through oceanic knowledge integration, while environmental protection benefits both communities through accident reduction. Thalassa observes with assessment that encompasses both technical evaluation and policy consideration, whose implications extend beyond individual case to include cultural precedent. The deliberation that official consideration requires encompasses both individual case evaluation and broader policy implications, whose scope includes cultural evolution toward interspecies cooperation that serves environmental benefit while honoring individual autonomy about relationship choice, whose exercise demonstrates character transcending tribal restriction. Precedent establishment requires evidence that benefit extends beyond individual case to encompass general principle about interspecies cooperation. Thalassa explains, with judicial reasoning that encompasses both current case evaluation and future policy development, whose foundation depends on demonstrable advantage rather than simple personal preference. Demonstration period permits relationship continuation, while evidence accumulates about practical benefit that broader cooperation could provide. She continues with compromise solution that encompasses both cultural caution and individual rights recognition through probationary arrangement rather than immediate enforcement action. Probationary period meaning relationship continuation under observation. Relationship continuation that demonstrates community benefit while maintaining cultural oversight about precedent establishment. Thalassa clarifies with official arrangement that encompasses both practical flexibility and institutional authority, whose exercise permits innovation within established framework rather than immediate radical change. The resolution that emerges encompasses both relationship preservation and cultural advancement, whose scope includes demonstrating practical benefit from interspecies cooperation, while establishing precedent that could influence broader social development toward environmental cooperation that serves mutual welfare rather than territorial competition. 6 months later, the success that probationary period demonstrates encompasses both technical achievement and cultural integration, whose scope includes navigation improvement that reduces maritime accidents, while environmental protection benefits both oceanic and terrestrial communities through cooperation that expanded relationship has established. Navigation charts have eliminated 17 shipwrecks while reducing fishing industry impact on oceanic breeding grounds. Thalassa reports with evidence that encompasses both technical success and environmental improvement, whose achievement validates relationship through practical benefit extending beyond personal satisfaction. Environmental Restoration Project encompasses both oceanic habitat protection and terrestrial coastal preservation. She continues with project documentation that encompasses both collaborative achievement and community benefit, whose scope demonstrates cooperation value transcending individual relationship through practical improvement. Precedent approved through demonstrated benefit that establishes framework for voluntary interspecies cooperation. She concludes with official validation that encompasses both individual case resolution and cultural policy advancement, whose achievement creates foundation for expanded relationship acceptance. The celebration that follows official approval encompasses both personal vindication and cultural victory, whose significance extends beyond individual relationship to include social progress toward interspecies cooperation that honors both individual autonomy and community welfare through practical demonstration of mutual benefit. As evening settles into rhythm that underwater existence provides, relationship that began through emergency rescue has evolved into partnership that serves both personal fulfillment and cultural advancement through love that transcends species boundaries while creating foundation for broader cooperation that benefits environmental protection alongside individual happiness. The bond that rescue established has grown into authentic love, whose strength encompasses both emotional commitment and practical partnership through relationship that demonstrates possibility for interspecies. Cooperation when shared values create foundation for mutual respect, environmental stewardship, and cultural innovation that serves both individual fulfillment and community advancement. 3 years after the tribunal's approval, the underwater research station that emerges from their partnership encompasses both architectural innovation and cultural achievement, whose scope extends far beyond initial navigation project to include comprehensive environmental monitoring, interspecies diplomatic facility, an education center that serves both oceanic and terrestrial populations seek. To understand marine conservation principles. The facility that Callum and Noreen have designed combines human engineering expertise with oceanic architectural wisdom, creating structure that operates seamlessly in underwater environment while accommodating surface dwellers through magical atmospheric adaptation that permits extended residence for research teams, whose work requires sustained oceanic immersion beyond normal diving capability. 17 research expeditions have documented previously unknown species while establishing breeding ground protection protocols, Callum reports during quarterly presentation to Joint Council that encompasses both oceanic tribal leaders and terrestrial maritime authorities whose collaboration has evolved beyond simple diplomatic courtesy to include operational partnership. Environmental restoration encompasses both coral reef rehabilitation and shipping route modification that reduces commercial traffic impact on migration patterns. Noreen adds with technical achievement that demonstrates practical benefit from interspecies knowledge combination, whose application serves both conservation goals and commercial efficiency through improved navigation. The family that their partnership has created encompasses both personal fulfillment and cultural breakthrough, whose significance extends beyond individual happiness, to include first documented case of successful interspecies, reproduction through magical adaptation that permits children possessing characteristics from both heritage lines while remaining fully functional in either environment. Coral and marina demonstrate dual environmental capability that neither pure oceanic nor pure terrestrial physiology achieves independently. Dr. Thalassa observes during medical examination that documents unprecedented biological adaptation, whose success validates magical intervention while establishing precedent for expanded interspecies relationship acceptance. Linguistic development encompasses both human speech patterns and oceanic harmonic communication, whose combination creates enhanced diplomatic capability. She continues with linguistic assessment that encompasses both individual achievement and cultural advantage, whose application serves expanding interspecies cooperation, whose benefits continue accumulating through practical demonstration. The children whose development represents biological innovation possess natural ability to navigate both underwater and terrestrial environments, while maintaining cultural connection to both heritage traditions through education that encompasses oceanic environmental knowledge alongside human technological capability. whose combination serves expanded career opportunities. Navigation Academy encompasses both traditional seamanship and oceanic current analysis, whose combination produces maritime officers achieving unprecedented safety records. Admiral Breton states during certification ceremony that validates educational innovation whose graduates demonstrate competency transcending either individual species' traditional capability through collaborative training. Environmental protection programs encompass both oceanic habitat preservation and terrestrial coastal management, whose coordination prevents resource conflicts while promoting sustainable development. Minister Clearwater adds with policy achievement that demonstrates governmental cooperation, whose success establishes framework for expanded environmental collaboration. The diplomatic protocol that their relationship has established creates foundation for broader interspecies cooperation, whose scope encompasses both environmental protection and cultural exchange through formal recognition that individual compatibility transcends species boundaries when shared values create foundation for mutual benefit rather than competitive advantage. Marriage certificate represents first official recognition of interspecies union, whose legal validity establishes precedent for relationship recognition across both oceanic and terrestrial jurisdictions. Justice Seaforth announces during ceremony that encompasses both personal celebration and cultural achievement, whose significance extends beyond individual case to include legal framework development. Treaty framework acknowledges territorial sovereignty, while establishing cooperation protocols that serve environmental protection alongside commercial advantage. She continues with diplomatic achievement that encompasses both legal innovation and practical benefit, whose application demonstrates governmental willingness to adapt traditional boundaries when circumstances demonstrate mutual advantage. The economic prosperity that collaboration has generated encompasses both technological innovation and environmental protection, whose combination creates sustainable development model that serves both oceanic and terrestrial population welfare through cooperative resource management, rather than competitive exploitation that traditional separation maintained. Joint fishing protocols reduce industry environmental impact while improving catch efficiency through oceanic knowledge about seasonal migration patterns. Captain Morrison reports with commercial success that demonstrates economic benefit from environmental cooperation, whose application serves both conservation goals and industry profitability through sustainable practices. Marine research encompasses both species conservation and medical advancement through compounds that oceanic biotechnology provides for terrestrial pharmaceutical development. Dr. Fernandez adds with medical breakthrough, whose achievement demonstrates scientific benefit from interspecies cooperation, whose scope continues expanding through sustained research collaboration. The cultural impact that their partnership has achieved encompasses both individual example and social transformation, whose scope includes gradual acceptance of interspecies relationship, whose success demonstrates compatibility, transcending traditional boundaries, when character compatibility creates foundation for authentic love, rather than simple curiosity about different species. Characteristics. 14 additional interspecies unions have received official recognition since precedent establishment. Registrar Delmar announces with cultural achievement that encompasses both legal recognition and social acceptance, whose development validates original tribunal decision about relationship benefits, extending beyond individual case to include cultural evolution. Community integration encompasses both oceanic acceptance of terrestrial residents and surface acceptance of oceanic visitors, whose presence contributes to economic development through specialized knowledge exchange. She continues with social achievement that demonstrates community benefit from cultural openness, rather than traditional separation that limited mutual advantage. As evening settles into rhythm that underwater residence has created through adaptation to oceanic light patterns, Callum and Noreen watch their children play in tidal pools that connect surface and depth through magical engineering that permits seamless transition between environments, while maintaining cultural connection to both heritage traditions. Rescue that began through emergency circumstance has evolved into partnership serving purposes neither individual nor species could achieve independently. Noreen observes with satisfaction that encompasses both personal fulfillment and cultural achievement, whose scope extends far beyond original survival necessity to include love-serving broader benefit. Claiming that seemed like possession has become freedom through relationship that honors individual worth while creating mutual support. Callum responds with recognition that encompasses both personal growth and cultural understanding, whose development demonstrates compatibility, transcending species boundaries through shared values rather than simple attraction. The bond that emergency rescue established has grown into authentic love, whose strength encompasses both emotional commitment and practical partnership through relationship that serves individual fulfillment alongside community advancement, environmental protection, and cultural innovation that demonstrates possibility for cooperation, transcending traditional boundaries when shared principles create a foundation for mutual respect and sustainable prosperity. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.